The boardroom was already buzzing when she stepped inside, one hand braced on the edge of the doorframe, the other resting over the curve of her stomach. 8 months along, she moved with steady control, every step drawing the eyes of people who knew exactly why she was here. At the far end of the polished mahogany table sat the chair with her nameplate, the position reserved for the lead negotiator in what was set to be the most important merger in the company's history. Except, someone was already in it. He leaned back as if he'd been born there, jacket unbuttoned, watch catching the light. His voice carried just enough for the room to hear. "Shouldn't you be on maternity leave? Let the big boys handle this." A few tight laughs slipped from the side seats. Others looked down at their notes, suddenly fascinated by the margins. No one told him to move. No one looked at her. She didn't reply, didn't blink. Her gaze drifted once to the chair, then back to him. Slowly, she reached into her bag, took out her phone, and pressed a single number. Her voice, calm but firm, filled only the few inches between her and the receiver. Call it off. All of it. 7 minutes from that moment, he wouldn't just lose a chair. He'd lose everything. Before we get further into this, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this, and let me know in the comments which country you're watching from. You're part of a global audience here. She had spent her entire career proving that brilliance didn't need permission to enter the room, but it still had to fight to be heard. From the moment she graduated MIT at 19, there was always someone ready to suggest she'd gotten lucky or been given an opportunity. That didn't stop when she earned her MBA from Wharton at 23, nor when she climbed the ladder in a male-dominated industry that quietly expected women to occupy the margins, not the head of the table. By the time she was 32, she had shattered those expectations, becoming the first Black woman to lead a multi-billion-dollar logistics company. She didn't inherit it, she built it, securing contracts across continents, pushing into markets others deemed too complicated, and earning the respect of shipping magnates who rarely respected anyone who didn't look like them. The $3.2 billion merger on the table that morning wasn't just another deal. It was the culmination of 2 years of strategy, negotiation, and travel across ports and trade hubs from Lagos to Rotterdam. It would give her company dominant control over east-west freight routes, rewriting how goods move between hemispheres. And it was her vision. Every clause, every term, every risk mitigated. Her name wasn't just on the paperwork, it was in the DNA of the agreement. That's why her presence in that room was non-negotiable. The head seat at the table wasn't ceremonial, it was where the lead negotiator could guide the conversation, counter attempts to amend terms, and protect the deal from being weakened in real time. She was 8 months pregnant, and her doctor had urged her to rest. "Let your team handle it," he'd said, citing the strain, the long hours, the unpredictability of travel. But she knew too well what could happen if she wasn't there. Deals this big weren't just about ink on paper. They were about power in the moment. Power had to be present to be effective. And she had seen more than once how absence could be used as an excuse to push her out of the narrative entirely. She wasn't going to let that happen. So she made the trip, her assistant clearing her schedule for the day, her legal counsel prepared to back her in every decision. She walked into that building knowing the stakes. If she wasn't in that seat, someone else could steer the outcome, and not in a way that protected the company she'd built. It wasn't just business. It was about visibility, about the message it sent for a pregnant Black woman to lead a historic merger in an industry that still, in whispers, questioned whether she belonged. That morning, the seat at the head of the table was more than furniture. It was proof of authorship, proof of leadership, and she had no intention of letting anyone take it. The only problem was, someone already had. The elevator doors slid open to the top floor, and the low rumble of conversation spilled into the marble reception area. The air carried that familiar blend of expensive cologne, brewing coffee, and quiet tension that always came before a billion-dollar meeting. She had arrived early, deliberately, in a room where the smallest perception could influence the outcome. Being first was its own form of control. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she approached the glass-walled boardroom. Through the transparent panels, she could already see the long table set for 20, the water glasses aligned perfectly, the notepads laid out with pens at precise angles. At the head of the table, her seat, the placard read in bold black print, Naomi Pierce, CEO. Except Naomi Pierce wasn't the one sitting there. Ethan Rowland, the company's vice president of operations, leaned back in the leather chair, one arm draped over the backrest as if he owned it. He was young by executive standards, mid-40s, and had a reputation for being ambitious to the point of aggression. Today, his navy suit was crisp, his tie slightly loosened in that studied way that suggested ease without effort. When he saw her in the doorway, his smile wasn't welcoming. It was the kind that came with an unspoken challenge. "Relax," he said, leaning forward just enough for his voice to carry. "I'll warm it up for you. This is where the action happens." The comment landed like a casual joke, but no one laughed. A few heads shifted, papers shuffled. One man 2 seats down looked directly at her belly, then away again. Her eyes moved to the placard in front of him, then back to his face. "That's my seat," she said evenly. Ethan's smile widened, like he was enjoying a private game. "We're all on the same team here. No need to be territorial." Before she could respond, the meeting coordinator, a woman in a tailored black suit holding a clipboard, appeared at her side. "Miss Pierce, would you mind stepping outside for just a moment while we sort the seating arrangement?" It wasn't phrased as a request to Ethan, only to her. The shift was subtle but sharp. A few colleagues avoided her gaze entirely. One adjusted his cufflinks and stared at the tabletop as though the grain of the wood was suddenly fascinating. Another kept typing on his laptop without looking up. The room had gone still in the way people freeze when they don't want to be involved. She stepped back into the hall, not because she was conceding, but because she had learned something important. This wasn't a mix-up. The placard, the agenda, the weeks of planning, all of it was clear. This was her seat, her meeting. And yet, here she was, being asked to wait outside like an afterthought. This wasn't confusion. This was choreography, and everyone inside knew the steps. Here's a good reminder. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this. And let me know in the comments which country you're watching from. You're part of a global audience here. The door eased shut behind her, muting the low voices inside. From the narrow strip of glass along the frame, she could still see Ethan, shoulders squared, leaning toward the CFO as though he'd been running this deal from the start. The posture wasn't random. It was a claim. She'd seen men like him her entire career. They didn't need to shout to take space. They simply acted as though it already belonged to them, and waited for others to accept it. And in rooms like this, acceptance came quickly. The meeting coordinator slipped back inside without another word to her. A group of junior analysts passed through the hall, their eyes flicking toward her briefly before dropping to their tablets. Not one of them stopped. Not one acknowledged the absurdity of what they'd just walked past. The lead architect of the largest merger in the company's history, standing in the hallway while someone else occupied her seat. Inside, voices rose and fell in fragments she could only partially catch. Ethan's laugh, the rustle of paper. Someone, the legal director by the cadence, asking, "Do we really need her here for the preliminaries?" Her jaw tightened. She'd been underestimated before, but the timing here was no accident. Removing her from the opening minutes meant removing her influence when the tone was set. And in deals of this size, tone dictated everything that followed. Through the glass, she caught the glance of one of the regional managers, a black man in his late 20s. He looked at her, then at the seat placard still in front of Ethan, and his brow furrowed. For a split second, he looked ready to speak up. Then his gaze dropped, and he turned back to his laptop. The dismissal wasn't just about gender or the pregnancy they all thought made her less available. It was about the quiet, enduring belief that she didn't belong at the center of power. That she should be grateful for the invitation, even if it meant standing at the edges. She shifted her weight, resting one hand over her stomach. The baby moved, a small, insistent reminder that some legacies were built long before they were seen. No, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was the opening move in a game they thought she'd already lost. What they didn't know was that she had no intention of playing by their rules. When the coordinator finally motioned for her to come back in, the meeting had already started. Ethan was still in her chair, elbows on the table, steering the conversation like the merger was his creation. "And if we move fast on the Rotterdam contract, we can shave 6 months off integration," he was saying, flipping through pages of the very projections she had drafted. She walked toward the table, her nameplate still resting in front of him like a misplaced truth. Ethan didn't pause or acknowledge her presence. His voice simply rose to fill the space she should have been commanding. "Morning," she said evenly, pulling out the chair directly to his right. The one reserved for secondary counsel. It wasn't her seat, but it was close enough to see every expression and hear every word. As she sat, she caught the coordinator leaning toward the chairman, voice lowered but urgent. He nodded once, then glanced in her direction. A brief, assessing look before turning back to Ethan, who was mid-sentence about restructuring oversight to ensure efficiency. Every detail in that phrase had been hers. Now it was repackaged in his voice, his cadence, his framing. A quiet movement to her left drew her attention. The junior legal associate, a wiry man barely out of law school, leaned slightly toward her. "They've been trying to edge you out for weeks," he murmured, eyes on his notepad. "Today's just the first visible move." She didn't reply, but the words slid under her skin like a warning. Her hand rested on the table, fingers still. She listened as Ethan fielded questions meant for her, pivoting responses to bolster his own profile. He smiled more than necessary, laughed at comments that weren't funny, and each time the room seemed to fold toward him. Subtle shifts of bodies, nods, the way chairs turned his way. It was the same choreography she'd recognized earlier. Only now she could see the steps. Claim the seat, claim the floor, claim the authority. And if she resisted, the narrative would flip. She'd be the one making a scene. Her mind pulled backward unbidden to a story she'd grown up hearing. Her mother, barely 20, had been invited to a local civil rights hearing in Mississippi. She had prepared for days, notes neatly written, a pressed dress, her hair pulled back to keep focus on her words. But when she arrived, the chair with her name on it was occupied by a white man who refused to move. When she objected, the clerk told her to sit in the overflow section at the back. From there, her testimony was barely audible, and the final record listed her as present, but non-participating. "That's how they erase you," her mother had said more than once. "Not by banning you outright, by making sure your presence doesn't count." Sitting in the boardroom now, she felt the echo of that moment. This wasn't about comfort or convenience. It was about erasure. And the worst part? The room was helping him do it, whether they knew it or not. She drew a slow breath, letting her gaze sweep the table. A few eyes met hers, then darted away. Ethan didn't notice, or pretended not to. It would have been easy to interrupt him, to reclaim her place with a firm reminder of the agenda. But she'd learned long ago, the real power wasn't in fighting for space. It was in deciding when and how to take it back so completely there was no question whose it had been all along. And the moment for that was coming. She let Ethan's voice fill the air for a few more minutes, his monologue looping back to points she'd already addressed in prior strategy meetings. Each time he reached for a new example, it was one she had authored. Each initiative he described had her fingerprints in the margins, and each time he claimed credit, the weight in her chest grew heavier. Not from shock, but from recognition. It was the same pattern her mother had warned her about. They take your work, your place, your right to be heard, and they present it as if it was always theirs. And if you object too loudly, they reframe you as the problem. She shifted her phone slightly under the table. No dramatic gesture, no tapping for effect. Just a small tilt of her wrist to unlock the screen. Her message was short, 15 words to the largest investor in the merger, a man who had once told her, "If you're not in the driver's seat, I'm not in the car. If I'm not leading this session as agreed, pull the funding." She hit send, locked the phone, and placed it face down on the table. Ethan didn't notice. He was too busy pointing at projected figures on the wall screen, speaking over the CFO as though he were clarifying something for everyone's understanding. 3 seats down, a director from the European division glanced at her, then at Ethan, his mouth tightening in a line. He didn't say anything. Not yet. The minutes moved quietly. Her phone buzzed once, face down. She didn't reach for it. Then the door to the boardroom opened, and the chairman stepped in. His expression was composed, but there was a new stiffness in the set of his shoulders. He carried no papers, no coffee, only his phone, which he kept in his hand as he walked to the head of the table. "Ethan," he said evenly, "step out of that seat for a moment." The room paused. Ethan leaned back in the chair that wasn't his and chuckled, the kind of laugh meant to signal he found the request ridiculous. "Step out," he repeated. "I'm in the middle of outlining our operational timeline." The chairman's tone didn't change. "We'll resume once you've stepped out." Ethan shook his head. "With respect, I think we need to consider optics here. Replacing a capable man in the middle of a presentation with someone who," he gestured loosely toward her, "might be a bit distracted right now." The word distracted hung in the air like an accusation. A few heads lifted sharply. One of the outside counsel's pens froze mid-note. Her hands stayed folded on the table. Her breathing didn't change. The chairman's eyes narrowed just enough to register the shift in the room. "Ethan, out, now." Ethan didn't move. "We've worked too hard on this deal for me to be sidelined over, what? A seating chart? I've been here since the start. Seniority should count for something." The CFO cleared his throat but said nothing. The European director leaned back, his gaze now fixed on Ethan, as though studying him for the first time. In the corner, the meeting coordinator's phone lit up. She glanced at the screen, her brow tightening, and slipped out into the hallway. Ethan kept talking. "Look, I'm not saying she hasn't done good work." A sharp exhale came from somewhere down the table. "But leadership in moments like this requires focus, not maternity leave planning." It wasn't just the words, it was the casual tone. As if the dismissal was obvious, as if her pregnancy somehow invalidated the years of strategy that had built the deal he was now pitching as his own. The chairman took a slow step closer to the head of the table, his phone still in his hand. "You've made your position clear," he said. "Now here's mine. You are not leading this meeting. Stand up and leave that seat." Ethan finally looked around, perhaps realizing the air had shifted. The nods he might have expected weren't there. Instead, he found eyes narrowed, lips pressed tight, and a silence that no longer backed him. The junior legal associate broke it first, not loudly, but loud enough. "The lead negotiator has always been Naomi. This is her deal." The statement wasn't met with argument. Ethan tried again, his voice edging toward indignation. "She's trying to hijack this meeting because she knows I have the confidence of." The chairman cut in. "What you have is a seat that doesn't belong to you, and you're keeping the person it does belong to from doing her job." The coordinator returned then, leaning toward the chairman and speaking in a low voice. He nodded once. "Stand or security will escort you," the chairman said plainly. A flush crept up Ethan's neck. "Security? For a disagreement? You're out of your mind." But he stood. Not because he wanted to, but because the weight in the room had shifted entirely. He wasn't in control anymore, and every person at the table knew it. She didn't move until he stepped away from the chair. Only then did she slide into her rightful place, her nameplate back in front of her, the merger documents under her hands. Ethan's muttered complaints trailed as he moved from that seat to another. When she looked up, the chairman's eyes met hers. "Let's proceed," he said. The next 7 minutes would decide far more than the outcome of the meeting. Before we get further into this, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories like this, and let me know in the comments which country you're watching from. You're part of a global audience here. The merger meeting resumed, but Ethan wasn't done. Even from the far end of the table, where he'd been moved temporarily, his voice kept cutting through the discussion. When the CFO began walking the room through the revised financial model, Ethan leaned forward in his chair. "We should all keep in mind," he said, "that these numbers were compiled under a lot of emotional stress. No offense, Naomi, but maybe you should let someone else handle the complex parts right now." Pen stopped moving. The camera in the corner, streaming for shareholders, kept rolling. Naomi didn't turn her head. She kept her eyes on the projection screen, flipping to the next slide in the deck. Her silence made his words hang heavier. The European director finally spoke up, his voice level but firm. "She built this deal. And you were sitting in her seat this morning." The room stilled. Every set of eyes shifted between the two of them. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You people always think you're owed something," he snapped, the words spilling out before he could pull them back. It was the corporate equivalent of a dropped glass in a quiet restaurant. An audible gasp broke from someone near the far wall. The legal counsel's pen fell from her hand. The chairman's brow dropped a fraction of an inch, but in this room, that tiny change was seismic. Ethan looked around as though expecting support, but the air had turned against him. The nods were gone. The murmurs he might have counted on never came. Instead, a slow, pointed silence spread like a curtain being drawn. Naomi stayed exactly where she was, her posture unshaken. She didn't meet his eyes, didn't give him the friction he was trying to create. Every ounce of attention in the room was now fixed on Ethan, and he was too busy defending himself to realize he'd already lost. "I'm just saying," he added, voice tightening, "if this company wants to look strong in front of shareholders, maybe it shouldn't be." He gestured vaguely toward her, making decisions based on personal feelings. The chairman didn't speak. He simply looked to the coordinator, who made a small note on her tablet. In the corner, the recording light stayed on, capturing every word, every grimace, every shift in the room's energy. Ethan adjusted his tie, but his hands trembled just enough for the cameras to catch it. His arguments weren't landing anymore. They were documenting themselves into evidence. And Naomi? She simply clicked to the next page of the merger terms and said, "Let's continue." The sharpness of that contrast, her composure against his unraveling, was the only headline the shareholders would need. The chairman's patience broke with the smallest movement, a pushback from the table, the scrape of his chair legs against the polished floor. "Ethan," he said, tone clipped, "this meeting is being recorded for shareholders. Every word you've said this morning is on record. I strongly suggest you excuse yourself now." Ethan laughed under his breath, though the sound carried. "You're actually going to remove me? For telling the truth? You think shareholders will be happy to see you hand control of this deal to someone in her condition?" A ripple went through the room. The CFO's jaw clenched. One of the regional heads sat back in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes locked on Ethan, as though measuring the distance between common arrogance and career suicide. The chairman didn't flinch. "You're not being removed for telling the truth. You're being removed for disrespecting a senior executive, undermining the agreed process, and jeopardizing the integrity of this merger." He looked to the coordinator. "Call HR." The words seemed to strip the smirk from Ethan's face. "You can't be serious." The door opened before he could finish, and the head of HR stepped in with the company's general counsel. No one raised their voice. No one touched him. The counsel simply placed a hand on the back of his chair. "Mr. Rowland," she said, "you'll need to leave the room." Ethan stayed seated. "You're making a mistake. I've been in this industry longer than she's been alive, and this is the thanks I get, replaced by someone who—" He stopped himself, but too late. The tension thickened. The recording light blinked steadily in the corner. Every person at the table knew exactly what he'd been about to say. "Sir," the head of HR said, "this isn't a debate. Please gather your things." Ethan finally stood, but he didn't go quietly. "Fine. Let's see how far this deal gets when it's run by emotion instead of logic." The chairman's eyes didn't leave him until the door shut behind him. Only then did he turn to Naomi. "The floor is yours." She slid her chair forward, resting both hands on the documents before her. It wasn't just about reclaiming her seat. It was about showing she'd never needed to raise her voice to prove it was hers. Over the next hour, she led the meeting with a precision that left no room for doubt. Questions were answered without hesitation. Objections countered with data she'd memorized months ago. By the time the final signatures were inked, the boardroom felt different. Not because Ethan was gone, but because the leadership at the head of the table was undeniable. In the hallway outside, she could hear the low murmur of voices, employees who had witnessed everything, already discussing what it meant for the company and for her. She didn't linger to listen. She had no interest in gossip. But she knew this. Words would travel faster than any press release. And by the end of the week, Ethan's name wouldn't be on the internal directory. By mid-afternoon, the story had already left the confines of the boardroom. The meeting had been recorded for shareholder transparency, But it wasn't the official company upload that caught fire first. It was a 20-second clip filmed on a phone from one end of the table. The video wasn't polished, but it didn't need to be. It showed Ethan in her seat, his voice clear as he questioned her emotional state and dismissed her role. It showed her sitting still, composed, refusing to bite. And it captured the moment he said, "You people always think you're owed something." Within hours, the clip was everywhere. LinkedIn feeds, business forums, Twitter, industry Slack channels. The hashtags began to multiply. Boardroom bias, she built the deal, Naomi Pierce. The official company PR team tried to keep pace. They released a neutral statement about ensuring professional conduct in all executive sessions. But by then, the conversation had moved far beyond corporate spin. Articles appeared in business media outlets before the day ended. Vice President removed from $3.2 billion merger meeting after disrespecting CEO leaked video, raises questions about gender and racial bias in the C-suite. The next morning, her inbox was flooded. Messages from women in law firms, tech companies, and finance, some she knew, most she didn't, thanking her for not walking out, for staying in that chair once she reclaimed it. Black professionals wrote about their own moments of being sidelined, of watching someone else take credit for their work because the room assumed they didn't belong. One email stood out. It was from a senior executive at a global shipping competitor. "Your composure under pressure was a masterclass. The industry needed to see it." Internally, the company moved quickly. HR confirmed Ethan's resignation within 48 hours. His biography vanished from the corporate website by the end of the week. No farewell email was circulated. In the following shareholder briefing, the chairman addressed the matter without naming names. Leadership is not just about skill, it's about respect for the people who build the vision. Without that, there is no leadership. She didn't need him to say more. The merger had closed on schedule, the deal secure, and her authority in the company stronger than ever. But beyond the contracts and signatures, something else had shifted, not just for her, but for everyone who had been watching. Her quiet refusal to leave the room had become a signal, and people across the industry were listening. She could have let it end there. A viral clip, a resignation, a private sense of satisfaction that justice had been served. But she knew better. Stories like this didn't just fade quietly, they either got buried or they got used. And if she didn't speak, the lesson risked being twisted into something smaller than it was. A week after the merger closed, she accepted an invitation to deliver the keynote at an international leadership summit in New York. The organizers had booked her months before to talk about global freight innovation. She decided to change her topic. Standing on stage, she looked out at an audience filled with CEOs, investors, and government ministers. She didn't mention Ethan by name, but she didn't need to. "I was asked to wait outside my own meeting," she began. "While someone else took the seat with my name on it, I stayed, and I took it back. But the bigger question is, why did the room accept it in the first place?" She spoke about the quiet ways bias worked, how it disguised itself as tradition, seniority, or optics, how it relied on silence from witnesses to survive. She told them what her mother had told her. "They don't always lock you out. Sometimes they just move your chair." By the end of the speech, the applause wasn't just polite. It was sustained. People stood, and afterward, executives she'd never met approached to say they were reviewing their own board protocols, adding equity clauses, and training staff on bias recognition. She didn't stop there. She launched an initiative through her company to sponsor leadership training for women and minorities in industries where they were still rare at the top. She personally mentored 3 young Black women in logistics that year, telling each of them, "You don't just get the seat, you keep it." The boardroom incident had started as an attempt to diminish her authority. Instead, it had expanded her platform, and she intended to use every inch of it. The messages came from everywhere. LinkedIn, email, even handwritten letters slid under her office door. A young law student wrote that she'd watched the clip of her reclaiming her seat before every moot court competition. A retired teacher said it reminded her of the day she refused to let a younger male colleague take credit for her curriculum. Some notes were deeply personal. A woman in Atlanta wrote, I've been told to wait outside while men decide what I'd be allowed to work on. Watching you sit back down in that chair, it healed something in me." Others came from those who admitted they'd once been the silent bystanders, looking away instead of speaking up. "Your story made me realize that staying quiet is choosing a side," one man wrote. Even strangers in airports and coffee shops recognized her from a grainy phone video. They didn't ask for photos, they wanted to tell her what it meant to see someone stand their ground in a space they were told they didn't belong. Every message reminded her that the fight was bigger than one seat or one meeting. Racism in rooms like that doesn't always roar. Sometimes it leans back, smirks, and waits to see if anyone will object. She thought about her mother's words, the story of that civil rights hearing decades ago, the seat that was taken, the voice that was pushed to the back of the room. "They don't always lock you out," her mother had said. "Sometimes they just move your chair." That day in the boardroom, she hadn't just moved her chair back. She'd anchored it, for herself, for the women who would come after her, and for anyone told they didn't belong at the head of the table. And here's the truth: silence protects the wrong side. So I'll ask you, if you were in that boardroom, would you have spoken up? Or would you have let the choreography play out? Drop your answer in the comments. Share your own story, because someone out there needs to hear it. And if you believe these stories matter, hit subscribe. This isn't just a channel, it's a space where voices that were once told to wait outside get heard. Because the fight for a seat isn't just hers. It's all of ours.